Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the current session of ASSET. I am sorry for about 5 minutes delay in starting. We just wanted to make sure the live stream works in YouTube properly. We are here in presence of eminence personality, Ambassador D.B.Venkatesh Varma. He had almost 34 years of experience working in Indian origin service, and he has worked as an ambassador with Spain as well as Russian Federation. And he has been a disarmament head for the Indian Foreign Service in Geneva. And he is an eminent expert in a strategic field. And he has been one of the leaders in civil nuclear deal, which we had with America and things. So we are here very lucky to have him speak about strategic geopolitics and Indian role in that. And in future, what is the path or the roadmaps to strategic thinkers. And I'm hoping that we will have a very pleasant interactive sessions with him. And you are all welcome to question as and when you want to, in case he wants to have an interactive, or after the speak, we will be having the things. Without further ado, I request Ambassador to give a speak.
Yeah. Is it working?
Yeah.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Namaskar. My respected director of TIFR, my esteemed colleague and very dear friend of many years, Dr. Grover, Dr. Parag Shah, the coordinator of ASSET. Thank you very much for inviting me to this very prestigious program, which has been going on for many decades, to this very prestigious institute, to speak on technology and national security and India's place in the global order. Now, my entire life I've been a diplomat. Except for basic science, I'm not a scientist. But I spent much of my life, professional life, working with scientists on issues that deal with science and technology and its applications for national power. So why is that so? And in this context, I should recall that some of the great doyens of India's nuclear program, Dr. Chidambaram, and Dr. Kakotkar, and Dr. Grover, who's sitting here, have been my mentors, my collaborators in this. I will start with the paradox and I'll end with this paradox. And the paradox is the following. Science and its principles are universal. Universal. I mean, you have a principle of science, it should be valid here in India, as in America, as in the moon, as in Mars and outer space. Scientific research, the crucible of scientific research is international cooperation. Science does not readily recognize or accept national borders. That is the nature of science. And the best example of that, I think, is the experience and the life experience of Dr. Homi Bhabha, the person who established this great institution of research and learning. He was an internationalist. He established national institutions, but he knew the galaxy of scientists of his age. And he was one of the big stars of the scientific galaxy of the 1940s, the 1950s, and the 1960s. So much so, he was asked to act as the president of the Atomic Energy Conference in Geneva in 1955, a great honor, one of the biggest scientific conferences ever. But why is it that when it comes to applications of science, and applications of technology, the scope shrinks dramatically and becomes national in character. It does so for every country. It does so practically for every technology. And this intersection, this paradox that we see between science, scientific research, scientific collaboration, and the applications of technology, this interface between scientific applications and technology and national security, that is the interface where I have spent my life. I want to share some experiences of that with all of you. It's slightly different because I'm not a scientist and I'm speaking to an audience which is predominantly interested in science. But I think it's important, probably interesting for all of you to also see how this operates in a context. There was a clear recognition even before our independence that science and technology would be critical for our development. That's pretty obvious. It's also very clear to us that our science and technology prowess, our domestic capabilities, our institutions, our scientists, our discoveries would also be responsible for finding India's place in the global order. Why is that so? Power creates hierarchies. Technological power will also determine where in that hierarchy will you be fitted. Whether you will fit yourself or someone else will fit your country for you. And two particular principles, which we will again come back towards the end of my presentation. Technology is an instrument of power. Possessors accentuate or magnify their power through possession of technology. And possessors make the rules. So let me exemplify this by our experience in the nuclear, space, and defense fields.
Do you prefer questions now or a little later after your talk?
Either way, I'll make my initial presentation and then we can. But if there's a pressing question, please. Yeah. By the time India became independent in 1947, the nuclear order was already set in motion. The United States of America tested its nuclear weapons and used its nuclear weapons in 1945. The Soviets followed suit in 1949. And the British and the French conducted nuclear tests in the 1950s. And then by 1964, the Chinese had conducted their first nuclear test, first explosive test. Homi Bhabha's perspective on nuclear policy was largely shaped by his international experience, but also his international understanding of how power politics flowed. But finally, he was a nationalist and he worked in the Indian milieu. And the Indian milieu was one of a newly independent country, a little bit shy of accepting the power equations of the global order. A certain belief that international appeal on disarmament will have some effect, and a certain moral revulsion to nuclear weapons. So this created in the 1950s a certain context in which India's approach to nuclear weapons arose, but also remained stunted. It arose, but remained stunted. So India, Prime Minister Nehru, who was in the initial years a major force in shaping India's views on global affairs, was a strong advocate of non-testing, of putting restrictions on the nuclear weapon states. And India was a great advocate of banning nuclear weapons, particularly their use leading to their elimination. This is what we asked for. What did we have here in Mumbai, in Trombay, and things like that? The nascent green shoots of our nuclear technology, nascent green shoots, which is the Atomic Energy Committee was formed, the Atomic Energy Commission was formed, the Atomic Energy Act was formed. Baba had started creating this nucleus of nuclear scientists who would, in TFR, in other places, the manpower was put in place, and slowly we inch towards international cooperation for creating critical technologies in terms of reactor technology, in terms of other attributes of technology that go into making of nuclear weapons. The public advocacy of nuclear energy was purely peaceful in India's case. We said that it was necessary for developing countries, it was necessary for India's growth, and we would not accept a place in the global order that was discriminatory against India's peaceful use of nuclear energy. We did not openly say that we would actually require to keep the option open for making nuclear weapons. This position changed, of course, in 1964 when the Chinese went nuclear. They became a nuclear weapon state, having defeated us in 1962, where we performed rather badly in the 1962 war. So the security consciousness of our nuclear program started to build up in 1964, 65, 66. And I think if Baba were to be alive, and if Shastriji were to be alive, I think we would have probably gone ahead in a far faster form, a far quicker form towards nuclear weaponization than had been the case. As you are aware, in January of 1966, both Prime Minister Shastri died in Tashkent, and Dr. Baba tragically died in an air crash in Switzerland. That delayed our progress towards nuclear weaponization, though by 1964, we had the first reprocessing plant. We had Cyrus and Apsara before that. We were able to, we had reactors which had gone critical, and we had the basic rudimentary forms of reprocessing. We had produced our own plutonium by that time. Though it is said that if Baba had 18 months more, it would have gone. But India also went through a very torturous process of self-dialogue, of saying, is it moral? Can we afford it? Is it really necessary? Can we seek other countries' support for our security by not going ahead with nuclear programs? The reason I say this is that there is no other country in the world which went through the same process of self-analysis as India went. There was practically no public debate in the United States of America. Once the technology was available, within a month, they used it twice against defenseless Japan. Having seen that, the Soviets didn't think twice by launching a nuclear weapon program. By 49, they had done that. Similarly, the Brits and the French. It is India that went through this tremendous process of. Now, what effect did it have between our technological possession, what we had, and the international regulation that came about? As I said, possessors make the rules. If you possess a technology, the countries that possess the technology will make the rules for its application. It happened in nuclear, it happened in biological weapons, it happened in climate change, it will happen in the internet, and 100%, please be assured, it will happen with artificial intelligence. When there are international rules, the rules will be made by the big generators of artificial intelligence, not the users of artificial intelligence, but the generators of artificial technology. We'll come to that in a moment. So in the nuclear field, the problem arose that in 1967, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was being negotiated in Geneva. And the treaty clearly gave specific advantages to the 5 nuclear weapon states, which had conducted nuclear weapon tests before 1st January 1967, which was what? The United States of America, the Soviet Union, France, Britain, and China. If India, having reprocessed plutonium in 1964, had conducted a nuclear weapon explosive test in 65 or 66, by the time the deadline came for 1st January 1967, probably we would have been included as the 6th nuclear weapon state. We didn't have it. No country was willing to support us. We were slow in developing the technology. We were slow in developing technology, not because we didn't have talented people, but the political and the policy alignments, the technological alignments didn't come together at the same time. Now, please remember this. I will come back to this towards the end of my presentation again. Alignment of diplomatic means, of your political opposition, and your technological means. All three have to come together in one line. That is when the light goes through. So in 1967, our demands for nuclear disarmament were not accepted. The special privileges were given to the 5 nuclear weapon states. India was outside. So fortunately, under Mrs. Indira Gandhi, we took the decision not to sign the NPT. It was a half measure because we were quite helpless. We didn't have the means. Our demands were not being accepted, including the threat that we faced from China. The same process of self-analysis continued, and we delayed our first nuclear test until 1974. And that too, we said it in a rather roundabout manner because we were hesitant to call it a full nuclear weapon test. We called it a peaceful nuclear explosion. Because part of the political process of building support for nuclear weapons in India was itself fragmented. It came in bits and pieces. First, we said absolutely no to nuclear weapons. Then we said we don't mind a nuclear umbrella of other countries. Then we said we want nuclear weapons to be supplied by us, by foreigners, if in case we were attacked by China. Then we said, okay, we will have peaceful nuclear explosion, but it will not be for weapons purposes. Again, a very self-torturous explanation that we underwent. Anyways, in 1974, we conducted our first test, which was Pokhran-1. And normally you would have expected that having conducted the test, having come out, we would then go out fully and go full ahead and develop our nuclear weapon program. That didn't happen. In fact, what happened was the nuclear weapon program, which was in DAE, actually withdrew into a shell again. And Dr. Raja Ramanna, who was one of the great doyens of the DAE, was witness to this. It was not again activated until the late 80s. By which time, and the end of the 80s, early 90s, the Soviet Union collapsed. And all the 5 nuclear weapon states got together and they decided that the priority was to prevent other countries from getting nuclear weapons, which is basically India and Pakistan, and DPRK and Iran and Israel. Israel is a separate case because they have good relations with the US. They don't mind that. But India came under a lot of pressure in the early 90s. But fortunately, under Prime Minister Vajpayee's leadership, in 1998, India finally, we went across the Rubicon and we conducted 6 nuclear weapons tests, and we said we are a nuclear weapon state. So this process that began in the mid-60s culminated in the 1998 test, where we finally said, but then we were subject to a lot of sanctions, particularly from the United States and their allies, on our nuclear, space, and defense programs. DAE, Department of Space, and DRDO were subject to a lot of sanctions. These sanctions were slowly started getting lifted by the year 2000. And by the year 2002, all the big sanctions had been lifted, but the critical sanctions against DAE, Department of Space, and DRDO were still there. Then, so there were some efforts between India and the United States, which is the main country that imposed these sanctions, of some form of engagement. And that engagement went through several phases between the year 2000 and the year 2010. The first phase was what is called the Jaswant Singh Stroud Talbot talks. Those who are interested can read that. Then the next phase was called the NSSP, the Next Steps in Strategic Partnership, where the Americans lifted some side sanctions, not the main sanctions. And the main sanctions lifting exercise came about between 2005 and 2010, which was called the Civil Nuclear Initiative. The Civil Nuclear Initiative was essentially negotiated between India and the United States, but it was not the only negotiation. India also negotiated with the IEA, with the NSG, Nuclear Suppliers Group. It negotiated with other nuclear powers. And so it was basically a very broad negotiation on.
Hello.
Yeah. A broad negotiation on two things. What were the restrictions that India wanted to be lifted on its nuclear program? And what was the price that India was willing to pay for that? And what were the terms and conditions of this deal? Essentially, civil nuclear deal is this. What will you get? For what price you will pay? And what are the terms and conditions of that deal? And I will simplify it. Of course, Dr. Grover and I, we were, between the two of us, we have negotiated almost, there were about 14 or 15 agreements. Between the two of us, we have negotiated almost 13 or 14 of them. 90% of the things was negotiated by the Dr. Grover and me. There were many negotiating teams, but we were two constant irritants for the others. But let me summarize this. India had a mixed nuclear program. We had about a very large number of power reactors, which we had built ourselves, because we were under sanctions from 1974 onwards. Once we conducted the test in 1974, the Western countries imposed sanctions on our nuclear thing. They didn't give nuclear technology to us. No equipment was given. They stopped the fuel for Tarapur. They made us jump up and down for getting Tarapur fuel by step. We had a lot of difficulty. It was a mixed program. Mixed money. Largely, its effort was civilian. It was producing power for the economy. So it was a nuclear power program. But some elements of that, because it was all our own, we used for building up our nuclear weapon program. This basically some amount of fissile material, some amount of, all the materials that go into building a nuclear weapon program, nuclear weapons, tritium, polonium, whatever. But it was all sourced from our own. So the fundamental principle of international cooperation was imposed by the Americans is that we don't support your nuclear weapon program, but we will give you support for your civilian program. So we had to then separate the military program from the civilian program. This was what is called the separation plan. And what is the separation plan? We said we had so many reactors, say 23, 24 odd reactors. We said these were civilian, these were military, unsafeguarded, and all this all the civilian reactors would go under safeguards under the International Atomic Energy Commission, IEA safeguards, for which we negotiated a couple of agreements with the IEA, which was called the Safeguards Agreement and the Additional Protocol. And the principles of supply to these nuclear program was controlled by the Nuclear Suppliers Group. So we negotiated separate agreements with the NSG. And the main supplier, nuclear supplier countries which had uranium, which built reactors, which gave heavy water, which created power equipment for nuclear reactors, turbines, we concluded agreements with almost 15 or 16 of them. This is called the nuclear deal. What did we gain and what would we lose in that agreement? So a lot of things is done to ask, what did we gain? What did we lose? I would say it was a win-win situation. We were short of uranium in our country. What little uranium we have is used for our power reactors. More uranium we are unable to source because there is always some agitation that takes place in various states for political reasons, not for nuclear-related reasons. And therefore, we've always been short of nuclear fuel. After the nuclear deal has taken place, there is no shortage of international supply of nuclear fuel for a reactor. There's absolutely no shortage. So if all the reactors which have subject to international cooperation, and we have international cooperation with almost a dozen countries, there is no shortage of fuel. So our nuclear program more as we move forward. By 2030, we almost expect to double our the size of the megawatts under. What we also gained was an American recognition that India has a nuclear weapon program, and India is entitled to keep its nuclear weapon program. This despite the fact that India did not sign the NPT. So you see, in 1967, we didn't sign the NPT. In 2010, 2008, 2010, we took almost 4 decades to go through various international sanctions to come to the stage where you got mainstreamed. Was it easy for us? Answer is no. Did it cost us? Tremendously. Were we isolated? Tremendously. But in all such matters, while international cooperation in science is good, if you have talent in your country and you are internationally isolated, actually it is an indirect impetus for your own production. So DAE indigenized its talents, and by it created a domestic capacity today, which is now one of the best in the world. I would say in the PHWR business, this Kandu reactor business, our reactors, originally the design came from Canada, but we adapted it and run it so well that our reactors now are one of the best in the world. Our fast breeder program, though it is slow, is still amongst the cutting edge fast breeder programs in the world. So we have not only gone through a difficult phase, we have come out stronger in that. So this is the second lesson that we learned, that in international isolation, the costs are high, but if you stick to your objectives, actually you can gain from it. I will say that India has also been mainstreamed in international cooperation again back. A lot of countries have come back to do business with us. They talk to us. Dr. Grover was also responsible for getting India into ITER program. We are also part of CERN. So India's respectability in the nuclear field has again come back. A similar process went through our space program. India had a space program which was very similar to the nuclear program, where the main objective was developmental activity. A small offshoot was military application, but we came under a lot of pressure internationally because of the military application. So what was the military application in the space program? We started creating the first rudimentary military satellites, and we started using the same facilities for launching our missiles and launching our satellite launching vehicles, which was objected to by the Americans in the year 2000. And we started separating the program, like there was a separation in the nuclear side. There was a separation in the space program also in the early year 2000s, in that decade. So the American restrictions on our space program were in fact less than in the nuclear field. But these were also lifted as part of the nuclear deal that we did. And so much so, now we are members of the Missile Technology Control Regime. So here too, we have been. We had some restriction on the cryogenic engine. We wanted the cryogenic engine from Russia. The Americans said no. The Russians gave us some support anyway. And now we have almost a domestically manufactured, indigenously developed cryogenic engines of our own. So similarly, when you are put under international pressure, over a period of time, you are able to develop. It is not the best way to develop. The best way to develop is through international cooperation. But if the price to be paid for international cooperation is the suppression of your own scientific capabilities, then it is better to develop your own scientific capabilities indigenously yourself rather than succumb to international pressure. With regard to defense, the defense is a different sort of story. There have been very few instances where there have been sanctions on India in the defense field, except for the 1965 war and 1971 war, and again after 1998 nuclear weapon states. But there have been no particular sanctions against India. But there has been a great reluctance for the Western powers to supply weapons to India, largely in the 60s and 70s, because they thought we were very pro-Soviet and pro-Russian. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they still didn't supply weapons to us in a very major way until the nuclear deal was done. So the nuclear deal, particularly, is not only has been helpful with regard to our nuclear program and space program, because many of the sanctions were lifted because of that, but it also lifted the burden in India-US defense cooperation. So between the year 2000 and the year 2022-23, we have imported almost 20 billion worth of weapons from US. There has been a lot of criticism, ongoing criticism on how science and technology has not helped in the development of indigenous weapon systems in India, leading to constant high imports of foreign weaponry into India. You must have seen this in the newspapers and all. Partly, I think the criticism is valid, but partly, I think the criticism is also a little unfair. Because if you see the circumstances in which we came up, the possibilities of international cooperation that we had, the possibilities of technology transfer for weapon systems was not fully utilized. Firstly, the West was not willing to transfer any technology. Even today, except for the French in the Scorpion deal, except for some technology in terms of engines, generally they have not been willing to supply technology to us. Russia has been different. We've always had a licensed production relationship with Russia. So Russia supplied the main armament to us. They also gave us the license to manufacture that amount of armaments in the country. Licensed manufacture of armaments in the country leads to about 40-50% of technology transfer. This is the general average. It does not lead to 100% of technology transfer. So over a period of time, DRDO and our defense PSUs have absorbed a certain amount of weapons technology, defense technology from the Russian side. But that has amounted to only about 50-60%. That is the first one. Secondly, what is the other methodology of getting to technology? What are the various methodology technology? Best is your own. You have domestic research and development. You develop your own technologies, you deploy them, you manufacture them, no questions asked. Second is technology transfer. It comes through license production. Third is joint ventures. You ask a foreign firm to come and establish in India. The Indian firm and the foreign firm work together. There is a certain amount of technology transfer. This happens very often in the civilian field. It doesn't happen so very often in the defense field. The third. The fourth is outright technology transfer, where you buy high technology stuff from a foreign vendor. That almost never happens. No foreign vendor will give you the best technology, 100% they will transfer it to you. They will give you maximum 60, 70. Russians have been able to give us about 70% of technology, for example. But 100% nobody gives. So then what do? Then you have to say that what is that 30%? Then you have to depend on the foreign vendor to see how you can do this. Technology is not technology per se. It's not like producing ice cream where there's a constant demand. Technology in the defense sector has to be relevant technology. What is relevant technology? It has to be relevant to the doctrine. What is the doctrine that is required? It depends on the security environment. If the Chinese are fighting with 1960s weapons, if you have 1970s weapons, you are good enough. But if the Chinese today are fighting with 2030, 2040 type weapons, even your 2010 weapons will not be good enough. So it's always relative. Now, the reason why India has always gotten into this trap of not having enough defense research inside the country and getting more and more from outside is this tussle between the DRDO, Defense Research Development Organization, and the armed forces. The armed forces say we want more advanced stuff, we want it quicker. DRDO says we'll make it, but we'll give it to you in 10 years' time. The armed forces say 10 years' time is too long. We want it in 5 years' time. Okay, if you can't do it in 5 years' time, we'll buy it from abroad. Once you buy it from abroad, the ability of DRDO then to take it up. So it's a constant thing. Now, government has taken this very seriously, and I think there is a concerted effort now to break this vicious cycle. And they want looking at a reform of the DRDO. They're looking at more private sector participation. They're looking at more participation of competition between more manufacture in India, what is called Make in India Atmanirbhar Bharat program. And they're also saying if foreigners want to sell arms to India, they can sell arms to India provided they manufacture them in India, the joint ventures in India. So this shift has happened. I think it's a very positive shift because we were stuck in this cycle for almost 30, 40 years. So in an effort to break this vicious cycle, the government has doing this. It's still a reform in progress, but I think it's a necessary reform. There's still a lot of difficulties ahead, but we'll see how it goes. Now, we've seen reform of DRDO. There's a certain reform coming up. We've seen reform of Department of Space. Private sector has been encouraged to come in. There is a proposal for greater involvement of private sector participation in the Department of Atomic Energy in the nuclear field. Now, it is one thing to say that the private sector should be participating, which is a good thing. But it's another thing to say what does the private sector bring to the table? Obviously, something positive has to come. What do they bring? They normally bring more competitiveness, more efficiency, which is a fact. Hopefully, they should bring some financial capital, and hopefully, they should bring some technology. Now, it's easier to get technology in the defense field and space field rather than in the nuclear field. So the private sector also has to be judged by the fact, what is it? What technology do you bring to the table? Let me assess this all and conclude in the next 5-6 minutes. As I said, India has faced restrictions of one way or the other since the 1950s and 60s. It is now that we are coming out of these restrictions. We've taken 40, 50 years. Part of it is because of our weakness. Part of it is because of our slow policies. But most definitely, the reason is this problem of alignment. We can't align our diplomatic, political, and technology things in the same line at the same time. Sometimes the technology is ahead, politics is not ready, politics is ahead, then diplomacy takes time to catch up, but all three have to be together. We are now fully recognizing that technology is an instrument of power for nation-state technologies. International cooperation is inevitable, necessary, inevitable, but it has its own costs, that we should remember. India's position today is much better than it has been in the past. But that doesn't mean the challenges are over. Every age, every time brings forth its own challenges. And what are these new challenges? There are new technologies which are coming. Digital space, cyber, artificial intelligence, quantum, new materials, biochemicals. There's a whole new range of technologies which are coming in. These are global in scope. These are everywhere, but local in concentration in the levers of the technology. For example, artificial intelligence is the perfect example, which will now determine our lives for the next 30, 40 years. Artificial intelligence deals with three things. One is computing power, the other is talent, the other is data. Three things. India is plentiful in data. India is a gold mine of data. We are plentiful in talent. With absolutely no problem. Our young generation is absolutely solid in talent. But all the computing power is concentrated either in the United States of America or in China. It's a G2, it's a duopoly. This is like the 18th century, where all the spinning mills were in Britain and all the cotton was in India. We were great producers of cotton, but all the cloth was produced somewhere else. So if we don't have our own share of data centers, our own share of computing power, our own share of... So here also there is now the same debate that we had on the nuclear age. There are those who say technology is universal global. It doesn't matter much whether it is this nation or that nation. We should be part of the supply chain process, and irrespective of where we are, we will benefit. To an extent, that is true, but only to an extent. As the nuclear thing showed us, as the space thing showed us, as our defense experience showed us, finally, there are risks also involved in getting India into a place where a technology where you don't have the key core technologies with yourself. Now, government has started several has taken various measures, including the National Deep Technology Startup Policy. I think it's a good thing. The Anusandhanam National Research Foundation Act has been established. We are doing it now. I mean, it's better late than never, but clearly we are late in the race compared to what the United States is doing or what China is doing. We were late in the race in the nuclear age. Remember? We took a wrong turn in terms of turning, and we took 30 years to come back onto the main road. So that should not happen with us with respect to there's more greater awareness. There's no more clearer political will now, clarity on. The question of low R&D in India, I think, is a continuing problem. India is growing, one of the fastest growing economies in the world. Clearly, we all understand that science and technology is critical to our national development and a national power, not just development, power. Where we stand in the world, it's critical. So what we spend, which is about 1.64, 1.65% of our GDP, is clearly low. Clearly low. There can be no two ways about it. But the argument that is often made is, if we increase it, do we have the absorptive capacity in our overall ecosystem? I think there is a point there. So it's not only spending more money, giving more funding, making it more regular and more smooth. So if you are allotted a project program, you are assured of funding for the next 5 years without interruption. That is one thing. But if you, in an old bottle, if you start putting more stuff, the bottle will break. So the ecosystem also has to be changed. And what is the present ecosystem? We are still largely a government-funded, research-driven ecosystem. 60% of our funds go into large government funded stuff. And the four big funding areas are DRDO, Defense, Department of Space, Agriculture, and Department of Atomic Energy. And in fact, Atomic Energy, which, actually gets the least amongst these four, DAE gets the least, but they have done outstanding work. It's not just a question of money. Money should be more. You can't say you can do it on the cheap. You see, any respectable science technology power spends 2% of its GDP on R&D. But before you do the 2% GDP, you also do an ecosystem. And the critical flaw in our ecosystem, and this is not my original point, a lot of people have said it, the higher educational institutions are the key weak link in our research chain. Because a point has been made, and you see China, you see Japan, you see Korea, this new technology pass, not the Europeans and the Americans who've been technology experts right from the beginning. The link between higher education institutions, which is postgraduate students, onwards to PhDs, following up into research institutions like this, or following up into industry, we fund the least, which is about 8% or 9% of our funding goes to higher. So you produce a lot of PhDs outside, not in institutions. Here you produce world-class PhDs. But in the vast majority, so for example, we produce what? 300,000 PhDs a year. A very large number. But we know what that PhD value is. The second big problem in our ecosystem is, and this has been a problem right from the beginning, small islands of excellence, world-class excellence, in a sea of large mediocrity. Small islands of excellence in a sea of large mediocrity. Where India was not very well engaged with the world, in small islands of excellence, these people went off abroad. When India is now engaged with the world, these small islands of excellence are working for supply chains which are linked to abroad. So still we are not getting the full benefit of the talent we are producing in our country. For example, there are now global research centers that have been established by big multinational corporations in India. In Hyderabad, where I come from, in Bangalore, in Mumbai. They are small enclaves, islands by themselves. It's a technology chain that originates in the US or Europe, comes to India, and goes back. Our very talented kids contribute to that. Very little of it comes to the Indian economy or upgradation of the technology skills. So it is a closed loop. So you have a supply chain, but you have a closed loop, which is another version of our talent going abroad and, a little bit of it coming over a period of time. This brain drain thing. Now, it's not that we want to stop our talent being utilized anywhere. I think they should have the best opportunities anywhere. But the problem still arises, what is it that we are going to do about our own country? How do we create the critical mass of research talent? And talent is not, India is never short of talent. That one God has given us that good grace. But how do we put it together? Alignment, again, technology alignment, along with the political alignment, along with the economic alignment, along with the diplomatic alignment. That going forward is a big issue. Let me conclude by saying India cannot become a great power without technological power. Strategic resilience includes technological adequacy, strong enough to engage with the world on our own terms. If we are not strong enough, other people will put terms of reference for you. We should be open to the world. There's nothing as bad as closing our doors to the world, especially in the area of science and technology, because then you shut yourself off. But you should be strong enough that once you open your doors, you will stand on your own feet. You will have your own mind, your own will. You will have your own contributions to make. Now, when TIFR was established by Dr. Baba and with the with the support of Prime Minister Nehru and the support of the Tata Group, I think this was their vision, that India should cooperate fully with the outside world, but India should cooperate fully with the outside world on its own terms. And this institution was built specifically to bring up people, to nurture not only prophetic vision, but also great talented minds, which Dr. Baba embodied. And I'm very happy to be part of this discussion today, to meet young scholars in the presence of the director and my colleagues. Well, thank you very much for this opportunity, and I'll be happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much. Great talk, and I'm sure there are plenty of questions. Let's go.
So my talk was triggered at the beginning of your, my question was triggered at the beginning of your talk, but actually since you came back to similar topics at the end, it actually connects to the end also, where you talked about technology and nations. But, the technologies we are talking about now, particularly things like artificial intelligence, is more tied to private companies, to large companies, and not really associated with nations as so, excepting perhaps in the case of China, where it's very difficult to make any distinction between which is a private company and what is the government. But everywhere else, that really seems to be more of something which is tied to a capitalist model of, creating a corporation which then is geared at making more and more money. And that thing has a life of its own, which doesn't necessarily follow some nationalist interests or so on and so forth. So I was just wondering whether you wanted to say something about that. But the other thing, because today morning Dr. Grover was also there, we were at the 70th anniversary of the DAE. And one of the comments that Dr. Kakodkar had made over there, I'm sure Dr. Grover probably knows much better than me about all these things. But what I understood him to say was that prior to 1974, there was actually a category of explosion called peaceful nuclear explosion. And so the Indian terminology was made to fit that category, that, this is a recognized category that they have of nuclear explosions. And so we called ours also a peaceful nuclear explosion. And I understood from what Dr. Kakodkar said that there were even conferences where they discussed peaceful nuclear explosions. But the moment India did one, that whole terminology and those conferences vanished. So, yeah.
So I think there are two very important questions. One is the role of the private sector. The role of private sector in scientific innovation has always been very evident in the West. But today it has reached a scale where the private sector is not only in a position to compete with states, but also dominates decision-making in states, including the most powerful country in the world, which is the United States. So if Meta, Elon Musk, and Google and all get together on a particular issue and say, this is what we want, there is no way that the United States government is going to say no to it. There is absolutely no way. Today, if you look at the key technologies on artificial intelligence, you see the supply chain of artificial intelligence, right from the production of chips, to fabrication, to software development, to photolithography stuff, where it is produced, where it is manufactured, where it is mass produced, where it is mass distributed, where it is sold, and what uses it is put to, and what data does it use on. Artificial intelligence is taking us to an extraordinarily new level of global inequalities. We have been unequal in very many ways for very long time. I mean, it's never been an equal world. But this will take us to an extraordinary level of inequality. We are not even beginning to understand the effect it will have on employment. Because if you look at some of the products that are coming out of artificial intelligence, they are very easily going to displace human activity, which requires a low level of cognitive application. I mean, call centers, service things, in which millions and millions of people are involved. The BPO industry in India. The trend is already like this. After 20, 30 years of high growth, it is already tipping. The way it will hit, we don't know. Now, what is it? The technology is held by 3 or 4 companies. Its impact is on millions of people. And so it creates new levels of inequality. In fact, people are saying that productivity in some parts of the world will be so high that they would, and lack of unemployment will be so high in other parts of the world. To maintain social stability, people are saying you have this so-called universal income concept, that you pay people to be unemployed. So these are some of the concepts that are coming. Now, this is only the beginning. We don't even know human. Now, we are pretty clear on, there are established patterns on how governments and states deal with each other. They call people like you and me, we negotiate agreements over a period of time. Some agreements are held, some are not held. This is an established practice. What do we do when your main interlocutor is not a government, but a private company? You have to negotiate firstly with the government where the company belongs, and you have to separately negotiate with that company. And the commitments that a government has given may not be applicable to, and governments are finally controllable by the fact of the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity. There is a particular border, there is a passport, there is a visa. We know some physical limitations of states. How do you find physical limitations of a company that has 60-70% of artificial intelligence computing capacity in the world? What will you do? Either you cut yourself off and live in the desert, or you find ways of dealing with it. We are clearly heading in that direction because there are 4 or 5 companies which are there in the United States which are absolutely critical. One company in the Netherlands. You have TSMC in Taiwan. You have a couple of companies in Singapore, Malaysia, Korea, China, and Japan. They presently control everything. If they were to decide, they will not decide, but if they were to decide that this is what we're going to do, this is how it's going to be. Irrespective of what we might do in our terms of governments or what the UN might do. I'm part of the UN Secretary General's Advisory Board on Disarmament Matters. So this is one of the issues that we'll have to deal with, because the power differential is so vast. Now, for India, the first thing is we should know how to deal with these players. First, understand the enormity of their power. Second, you strike a deal to see what is in your interest, what is in their interest, because nothing comes for free. Third, don't give away anything free. And what is our asset today? Our assets are 2: data. So this question of data sovereignty, who owns our data? If you ask them, they'll say, no, it is universal, it belongs to the world, that's what they'll say, because they want free data. We want to say our data, we should have some control over the data we generate. We are 1.5 billion people. So this give and take, this negotiation will go on. But sir, as you mentioned, this will be a very tough negotiation because the power differential is. So on peaceful nuclear explosions, you are right. In fact, in the NPT, Article 5 of the NPT mentions the right of countries to have peaceful nuclear explosions. So my view is that Homi Baba was trying to convince our political leadership saying that we wanted nuclear weapons. He understood very clearly that this was a very difficult task. While the government itself, some people in the government were ready, and I think Prime Minister Shastri was convinced that we require a nuclear weapon. The opposition, the other people in the Congress party, they were very strong Gandhian philosophy at that stage, were reluctant to say we want nuclear weapons. So Baba, I think, constructed a wire media because essentially the technology for nuclear weapons, explosive technology for nuclear weapons, and a peaceful nuclear explosion is not identical. It's similar. It's similar. Once you reach 90%, you can also reach 100%. So before he died in December 1965, Shastri actually told Baba, you go ahead. And Baba convinced. So Shastri made a statement on 27th November 1964 in Parliament, where he repeated all the arguments for not doing it. But for the first time, he said, but this doesn't prevent us from having a peaceful nuclear explosion. First time he said it. So he was convinced, since we couldn't convince our own people in one go, they went through. Now the question is, number one. Number two, if we were convinced in 1965, why did we take until 1974 to conduct the test? That is okay. We did it in 1970. Having done it in 1974, then why did we wait until 1998? If there is one reluctant nuclear power in the world, it is India. It is like we were reluctant at every stage. So I'm glad all that the thing is in the past, but we lost time. Basically, we didn't align our policies to the international situation. You should have a very clear understanding of the international situation. And your science and technology should adapt to it to see what is coming and act accordingly with political will. So that's why I say political, diplomatic, technology should all come together in alignment. Now, that is what we did in the nuclear. What I'm trying to say is that we should not repeat the mistake in the new technologies that are coming. Does someone ask? Yeah, please.
When you talked about when you talked about technology transfer, you often use the word technology from the West. What about collaborations with countries to our east, for example, Japan or Korea? Have they played any role in the technology transfer that we have got for our nuclear/defense programs?
No, you are asking about Korean experience or have the Koreans transferred?
Our experience with Japan and Korea collaborating with us.
Yeah, you see, in the civilian field, there has been technology transfer. But Japanese technology, Korean technology is supply chain technology. They first master a product which will essentially be sold in the United States of America. They master the technologies that will make it cheaper, more efficient to compete with the American market. They probably collaborate with American technology to begin with. They improvise and they master it. For example, Samsung, LG, Hyundai, they're all good examples of how they've done this. So when they come to India, they see what is necessary for them to transfer technology to get into this market. Now, we are not a weak country, so some technology has to be transferred. Some technology has to be transferred in any case for local production. If you want to produce a Samsung phone in India, some technology transfer will take some technology, not all technology. For example, Apple. Let me give you the example of Apple. Apple has shifted. Apple 15 is now being produced in India. 5 years ago, it would have been produced in China. We would have if we bought an Apple 15, we would have bought a made in China product. Today, it is possible to buy a made in India product. But that technology transfer is to the extent that the assembly of that iPhone will be done in India. So some upgrade you have had in your supply chain business, but you are not creating the product yourself. How many components of iPhone are you creating in India? We want to both manufacture the components and assemble the components in India. The best is we design and manufacture the components. Look at how China has moved in the last 30 years. It's a lesson for us. China's 30, 40 years ago, their institutions were like our institutions. First, they sent thousands and thousands of Chinese students to American universities. First, have the humility to go and learn, study and learn what is happening in the outside world. First requirement. Thousands, and we know probably 2-3 million Chinese students went abroad. At least half of them came back. Second, the Chinese got in touch with the best American universities and they opened their twin centers in China. Third, they asked American companies to come. First, they learned their technology. Second, they bought their technology. Third, they stole their technology. Fourth, they threw them out after they're stealing their technology. So why is there a fight between China and the Chinese are invested in their R&D? They spend more than 2% of GDP. They spend a lot of money. They're world-class institutions. Their research capacity today, see, one count said there are about 43 critical technologies in the world. 43 of which the United States is very good at 43. China is very good at 38. So they're almost there. In some areas, in terms of scale, they are ahead of the United States. But even today, the United States is still extremely inventive. Their research-based ecosystem is still very, very productive. So the United States can reinvent itself. But the Chinese are also very formidable in their... so where IPR worked in their favor, they worked with it. It didn't work in its favor, they broke the IPR. But the fact is that they have a very large mass. You see patents and see what are the key indicators? Patents, publications, and PhDs. 3 main indicators. We are 3. We are third. In numbers, we are 3. But you see in patents and in publications, the Chinese and Americans are way ahead. So it can be done, but we need to do it as a national process. We have islands, as I said, we have world-class islands of excellence, but in a sea of mediocrity. That has to change.
Your title was about technology and national security, and under national security, you seem to have presented a very limited, understanding of national security. Primarily weaponization, whether it's nuclear, space-based, or defense. But national security also has other meanings, and it has been, it's people. These are contested meanings, and particularly in the context of India, we are a young country. Our median age is around 28. So people talk about this demographic dividend, even to harness or even to leverage this. There's a lot more other things needs to be done. I mean, technology has a lot more other use too. So it's not just a one-dimensional picture. So that's one. The other thing was about the 1998 nuclear test. So you seem to suggest it's a very positive change. And I remember at that time, that was probably not the dominant view, not even the consensus view among the policymakers, and certainly not in the civil society. So there were a lot of protests all across the country. And you would remember in 1996, just 2 years before the test, the CTBT negotiations in Geneva, led by Arundhati Ghosh, and then she persuasively argued that, why India wouldn't sign NPT. We have the ability to make weapons, but we will not do it, but we will not at the same time give up that option. So that view was respected all across the world. And then just 2 years later, we just took this U-turn. And then you seem to argue that that has helped us in the long term, but it's not very clear whether it really has. So what I'm saying is this is one particular view, but there are a lot of other views around. I mean, not just among the civil society, but also among the policymakers. So it's not like, the only narrative possible.
No, that's a very good point. Firstly, on your point on national security, I 100% agree with you. I mean, this is a small lecture on. I wanted to give you examples on nuclear space and defense, which I am familiar with. I've worked on. That's why I gave it. But of course, national security is defined more broadly. Domestic stability, well-being of people. Are we able to create the conditions for the demographic dividend to come up? Unfortunately, we are not. We are more and more looking like a young country with the expenditures of an old country. We are giving freebies. States are competing with each other, giving free pass. So many free rice. It's like a pension country. Pension economy with a young population. So there is a problem there, because part of the reason you'll ask is, why do we spend only 0.69? Part of the reason is that there is not much money available for anything else, because we are doing all this other stuff, right? So national security is a good balance between your growth potential and your net output. As long as your net and your gross are, they can never be equal, but at least close to each other, you are a good functioning country. But if your gross is good, but your net is very low, if you have border problems, if you have instability, if you have communal problems, if you have corruption, if you have bad policies, which, all this, so all that also adds to your national security. I agree with you, it's much broader. On the nuclear issue, you see, my view, and I guess Dr. Grover also would agree with me, because we've had this experience. I've been in public service now for 40 years. And I've seen how people deal with us internationally, how it has changed in the last 40 years. Part of it is because now we are an established nuclear power. Part of it, not wholly. It's not that they respect you only because you have nuclear weapons. I think they respect you more because you've stood your own ground. We are the biggest dissenters of the NPT. There's no other. Pakistan hides behind us. DPRK is in a side category. We are the only dissenting country of the NPT. Because the NPT made a mistake by keeping us out. How can you keep a big country out of a treaty that's supposed to be universal? Now, we took our own way, a roundabout way of solving that problem. But India's respect is now more, not only because we are a nuclear weapon state, but we are not a very aggressive nuclear weapon state. We are a responsible nuclear weapon state. I mean, we have a no first use policy. We don't indulge in nuclear threats, and Thirdly, the respect is because we are a growing economy. The largest democracy, we have elections which have 700 million people voting, which is absolute phenomenon. Irrespective of what your views on the outcome of elections are, we all have our views. But the fact is that we still conduct elections broadly free and fair, broadly, on a very large scale, which is unimaginable in any part of the world. Fourth is, we have our own achievements. You see, India today still, for example, the Indian scientific community. The general impression abroad is that, these chap are clever, talented people. They work hard. They're, inventive. on the whole, we give a positive vibe. We give a positive, hopeful vibe to the world. It's very. Now, you can take the position that maybe we took the wrong turn by going nuclear. If you take that position, I will respect your view. But whether it would have added to our stature, our position in the world, I am very doubtful, because this is still a very power-conscious international system. Nobody gives you a place to sit if you, if they don't. I mean, it truly happens. I've been in international meetings where people don't listen to you. I've been in international meetings where they respect you when you speak. And I've been to international meetings where the meeting will not conclude without India voicing its view. And I've seen this change over the last 30, 40 years. And on the whole, you see, whether nuclear weapons will solve our security problems, the answer is not fully. It's not the only solution to our problems. But without nuclear weapons, will our problems get bigger? I would say yes. Can you just imagine? Today, the world is unable to control China's growth. It is a humongously powerful country. The United States is finding it more and more difficult to control China. China is a member of the NPT, is a nuclear weapon state under the NPT. It has no restrictions on its nuclear and missile program. Its economy, we are what, 4 trillion round out? They are about 19 trillion. See the gap. The one area where there is some competition between us and China is that they are a nuclear power, we are also a nuclear power. So some equalization has taken place. It is in one area. If you take that out also, just imagine, I mean, I don't know the deterrence level, but on the psychological level, I mean, it would be quite extraordinary if we were not psychologically on the back foot. We are not on the back foot because we have a certain bit of reassurance to ourselves. But going nuclear or not going nuclear, there's a debate. I fully respect your views, but I would submit my views that on the whole, we may have been a little late, we may not have done everything perfectly, but on the whole, the outcome is if the international system is still to be driven by a nuclear hierarchy, if we didn't decide the hierarchy, the nuclear system has an hierarchy. It is better to have some place in the hierarchy than to be stamped upon if you don't have nuclear weapons.
Can I? Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you for a very lucid narration there. So I want to draw your attention to an ongoing kind of a debate between the scientific community and the government. So on the one hand, the government exhorts us to develop advanced novel technologies. On the other hand, some policies of the government are preventing us from buying high-tech equipment, which are absolutely necessary in our labs. We like to protest this. We think it is stunting the advancement of technology if the government really wants us to do so. The government nudges us to look for local manufacturers, but from experience, we don't think that ecosystem exists yet. What would your take be on this debate with your perspective?
It's a struggle. It's a very familiar struggle. We've seen it in DA, we've seen it in DRDO. We see it in other areas. You see, finally, we need to get a very clear perception of national purpose. Clarity of mind has to be there across the board. Government, private sector, scientific community, the trading community. You see, I would say the general objective that the government is pushing, especially Prime Minister Modi is pushing, that we should find ways of standing on our own feet is essentially a good one. Because if you don't have your own strength, you may not, you will not count. So that is, I think, a very valid proposition. But how to go about it should be taken forward in the most, firstly, effective and most pragmatic manner. If it is self-defeating, finally, if the objective is good, but your process to get to it is self-defeating, then the purpose is lost. Now, I have full sympathy with your point. Let us not, just because it's Atmanirbhar Bharat, doesn't mean you need to reinvent the wheel. If the wheel has been invented somewhere, get it. But after the wheel has come here, you produce an Audi. Don't produce a Maruti. Right? So there is a responsibility on you as well. How will you use it? Right? Now, in a separate field, unrelated to scientists and national security, where Dr. Grover and we've spent a long years. In the trade field, all our private traders want access in foreign countries. They want low tariffs. In fact, zero tariffs. When we go and negotiate with that country and say, please give us, we want to export to you, they'll say, okay, we will give it to you. What can you give us in return? All our traders say no. Tariffs in India will remain. So we are not aligned again in our national purpose. And some competition is necessary. As in defense, as in nuclear, as in space, as in science, competition should be there. I worked many years in the Soviet Union and Russia. There also, they always deal with competition. It's a completely state-controlled business. But if there is a fighter aircraft being produced, new fighter, the government will say, ask MiG Bureau and Sukhoi Bureau both to produce a prototype. So nobody has a monopoly. So we may have a little bit of a monopolistic things in our own system. That also should give way to competition. Lastly, I think we have I don't say it as a criticism because I've been a bureaucrat myself. So I say it in all humility and respect. You see, we still have a bureaucracy that the average mindset is of the 1960s. There are, some sectors of our economy is first rate, is first world. We have a governmental bureaucratic system that is still able to process information. It is third world. It doesn't work. It cannot work. So how do we upgrade the information processing capacities of our bureaucracy? In other words, how do we create expertise in a generalist system where instead of being hurdles, they'll become facilitators? No, even among bureaucrats, there are very good exceptions. But in India, the exceptions are actually the big problem. The exceptions, I'll tell you, my experience is they don't allow the general common denominator to go up. Because the system is always on the brink of failing. Some good person comes and saves the system. Then you postpone the reform of the system for another 5 years. There's a problem there, right? So we need an upgrade in our systems as well. I mean, you can't run a $4 trillion economy like you ran a $500 billion economy. You can't. I mean, it's a contradiction in terms. So I would say everybody has to accommodate. But good luck with your whatever you want to do.
We will request other questions to be had in the interaction sessions. And I thank once again the speaker for a very wonderful interactive session. Can you please join for a tea in the West Canteen?
Hello, sir. I have a very important question. Can you answer? I put in chat. You asked me to type in chat. This is national security and cyber security. Hello, sir.
I will definitely relay, because we have already crossed 5:30. I will get back to you in maybe half an hour with the answer from the speaker. Thank you.